Velvet Trigger, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. Contact. It began with fog. A thick, soupy mist had rolled in from the river the night she arrived, curling between alleyways and glass towers like a living thing. Vilnius felt older than its bones, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Beneath the hum of street lamps and distant cathedral bells, something quieter moved. Something colder. Anya Morozova stepped from the black car and adjusted the hem of her charcoal coat, eyes flicking to the fog as if it might carry teeth. She always arrived like this, no bags, no goodbyes, no questions. Just a name, a face, and a silent understanding that she would not leave until that name was gone. The dossier weighed nothing in her coat pocket, but its details had imprinted themselves behind her eyes long before her plane touched down. Santiago Velasquez, 29, Mexican national, architect by education, cartel heir by blood, exiled here after a political incident too sensitive to explain, under surveillance, protected but bored, a man waiting to become something, or to be destroyed before he could. The Bratva wanted his breath to be the last thing he ever exhaled. For Anya, it should have been simple: surveillance, pattern, isolation, kill, disappear. It was the pattern of her life. Mikhail had not even disguised the finality of it when he handed her the file. Finish this, Detka, and you're done. No more safe houses, no more orders. This will be your last kill. He had kissed her hair after he said it, the way someone might pat a dog they were about to put down. She hadn't blinked. The apartment they had secured was sparse and functional, overlooking a worn, cobbled street 2 blocks from Santiago's known residence. She moved through it like a ghost, checking vantage points, exits, timing the creak of the stairs and the hiss of the radiator. Everything mattered. Patterns always told the truth, eventually. By the 3rd day, she had his routine. He rose late, lingered in the mirror as though fighting with something unseen, then disappeared down the back alleys of Old Town in the same tailored coat and scuffed leather gloves. He smoked only at night, rolled his own. He liked old books and empty churches. Not once did he speak to anyone. The cartel heir with a price on his head moved through the city, like a man already dead. Anya followed without being seen. The truth was, he made it easy. There was no entourage, no whores, no parties. The man she had been sent to kill did not behave like a future king of blood and guns. He spent hours sketching broken facades and water-stained ceilings. Once, she saw him pick up a stray dog's paw and check it for glass. The dog limped away. He lit a cigarette and stared at the sky like he expected it to crack open. None of it fit. She hated that it didn't fit. By the end of the week, she had memorized the rhythm of his walk, the slight drag of his left foot, the tension in his shoulders before he passed under surveillance cameras. He was alert, but not trained. A watchful poet. A damaged man in a dangerous shell. On the 7th evening, she followed him to the edge of the old Jewish quarter. The fog had thickened again, curling around wrought iron balconies and cracked stone. Santiago had paused beneath the archway of a crumbling synagogue, its gates chained but the doors unlocked. She followed at a distance, keeping to shadows. Inside, it smelled of dust and forgotten prayers. The chandelier had long since fallen. Benches lay rotted in neat rows, but he stood in the center like it was a cathedral or a tomb. Anya crouched behind a pillar, waiting. He pulled a book from his coat, read aloud. Spanish. Neruda. She recognized the rhythm before the words, something about sorrow being a language too old to translate. He closed the book after a few lines and just stood there, not praying, not hiding, simply listening to the silence press in around him. Anya had killed men in churches before, but this wasn't about sin or sanctity. It was about instinct, and hers was faltering. She watched him through the scope that night. Finger on the trigger, breath controlled, crosshairs still. He never looked toward the window, but he did pause up, just once, and tilted his head, like a man hearing music in the distance, and smiled. She didn't pull it. Not that night. Back at the apartment, she peeled off her gloves with surgical precision, placed the rifle on the table, and stared at the blank wall across from her until dawn. The next day, Santiago didn't leave his building. The day after that, he did, but turned in the opposite direction. Anya adjusted, recalibrated, chose a different vantage point. The kill could happen anywhere, but she found herself waiting longer than she needed to, watching him more than necessary. She told herself it was caution, calculation, making sure. But caution didn't explain the strange hollow that opened in her chest when he disappeared into a gallery and didn't come out for nearly 2 hours. Or the twitch in her stomach when she caught him sketching someone on a street corner. A girl in a red coat who walked right past her, never knowing she had been framed in the same line as a killer. The days began to stretch, not in time but tension. Mikhail's messages came coded, clipped. "Progress?" he asked. "Interference?" he offered. Her replies were colder than the city air. But something had begun. A shift. It was subtle, like the way one notices winter softening at the edges. She stood in the shadows, watching a man who should have been a monster. But monsters did not pause to watch pigeons spiral above stained glass. They did not walk with hands clenched in pockets like they were hiding trembling. And assassins did not hesitate. Yet Anya found herself waiting longer each day to leave her post. Not for opportunity, but for understanding. And though Santiago had never once looked toward her, never once altered his pace or made a move that betrayed suspicion, something in his stillness had begun to mirror hers. 2 ghosts in the same city, 2 predators circling. Or was it something else? The trigger remained untouched, but the space between them grew smaller. Not in distance, in inevitability. Chapter 2. Blueprints and Bloodlines. Snow fell in the morning, silent, sparse, like the city was being erased piece by piece. From her window, Anya watched the rooftop soften under pale white, the kind of cold that didn't sting yet, but promised to. The hour was too early for movement. Only the delivery trucks groaned along the cobbles, breath steaming like horses in old war films. Santiago hadn't left his building in nearly 36 hours. She noted the time, adjusted the scope, then leaned back into shadow. The heater ticked like a heartbeat under the floorboards. Her gloves, still damp from the night before, hung uselessly over the radiator. Below, a light flickered behind his window, not the soft lamp glow of reading or reflection, fluorescent, a workspace. She moved to the small table, slid open the worn dossier. One of the pages listed his university records: Mexico City, Madrid, then Prague. Architecture with honors. Honors meant nothing. People in power always found someone to gift them the illusion of brilliance. Still, the sketches told another story. In every cafe she'd followed him into, every gallery he haunted, Santiago left behind pieces of his mind, napkins folded with floor plans, ticket stubs scrawled with archways and window vaults, spirals and ruins, lines that made no architectural sense unless viewed from above, symbols hidden in symmetry. She traced one of them now, etched in graphite across the corner of a discarded receipt she'd stolen from a gallery trash bin. It looked like a ruin, but when she turned it upside down, it became a sigil, or a trap. That afternoon, Santiago emerged. No scarf, no gloves. His coat unbuttoned against the wind as though daring the air to touch him. He walked with less caution than usual, cutting down toward the quarter where students and tourists still lingered despite the cold. It was a Sunday. People laughed here. Couples passed with pastries and mugs of spiced wine. Life bloomed in miniature. He did not smile once. Anya moved parallel half a block behind. She didn't need to be closer. She only needed rhythm, timing, and it came in flashes. The way he slowed to watch reflections in puddles, how he studied door frames as if memorizing which ones would creak if opened in the night. He wasn't just seeing the world, he was measuring it. He entered a building tucked between an antique bookstore and a bakery, the door barely marked by an iron symbol bolted into the wood. Galeria Vejas. She waited 5 minutes, then followed. Inside, the warmth hit first, then the silence. No music, just thick carpet and the scent of old paint. The walls were hung with dark, abstract works. Nothing ornamental, all raw edge and texture. The kind of art that made patrons uneasy without knowing why. He was in the back, speaking to no one. His coat hung over a chair beside him. A tall canvas rested on an easel. She couldn't see what he was painting. He stood with one hand behind his back, the other loose at his side, still as stone. The gallery owner nodded to her without question. She'd worn the right coat, the right expression. She belonged, if only because she looked like she didn't care to. Anya moved to the far corner near a cracked sculpture of a torso missing its arms. From here, she had a line of sight. Not to kill. No, not yet. But to watch. Santiago didn't paint with elegance. His strokes were impatient, chaotic, but they built toward something coherent. A face, a skyline, a mouth half open. Whatever it was, it disturbed him. He stepped back more often than he painted, studying the canvas like it was telling him something he didn't want to hear. The light changed in the windows as afternoon leaned toward evening. Snow clung to the glass. Anya's phone buzzed once. A coded message from Mikhail. Need report. Unusual delay. She ignored it. When Santiago finally turned from the canvas, it was not to leave. He looked directly toward the sculpture where she stood. Not at her, not yet, just near enough. Then his gaze shifted. Just slightly. And she knew. He had seen her, not today. Not here. Not exactly. But before. There was no alarm in him. No fear. Only acknowledgement. Like a card turned over in a long game. He walked to the front desk, spoke briefly with the owner, and left. No glance back. She waited 10 minutes before following. Outside, the light was bleeding from the sky. No sign of him. But she knew where he would go now. His building, his rooftop, or the ruined church by the river. That night, she returned to her apartment to find a package slid under the door. A book, Spanish. 20 love poems and a song of despair. Inside, no note. Only a small graphite sketch folded between the pages. Her, sitting beneath a broken arch, looking the wrong way. The lines were rough but unmistakable. He had drawn her from memory, and he'd left it for her to find. She stared at the sketch for a long time. The paper trembled in her hand, not from nerves, but from something she could not yet name. Not fear, not excitement, recognition perhaps. Later in the dark, she sat with the rifle disassembled across the table. She cleaned it out of habit, out of ritual. The pieces felt familiar beneath her fingers, but her thoughts moved elsewhere. Why hadn't he run? Why, if he had seen her, did he invite her closer? And why, when she had the perfect angle, the perfect moment, did she choose not to use it? Not even for the Bratva, not for Mikhail, not for herself. The snow continued to fall outside, soft as ash. In the window across the street, his lights remained on. She watched them until dawn. Chapter 3. The Invitation. The gallery was silent when she returned. Same cracked sculpture near the door, same hollow-eyed curator who didn't look up from his ledger. Only the lighting had changed, warmer now, touched with gold, like someone had decided the truth would be easier to swallow if it looked like nostalgia. Anya stepped inside with the precision of a knife entering silk. No sound followed her. No scent. She knew how to move like nothing at all. But Santiago had already felt her coming. His back was turned again, though this time it felt less like unawareness and more like offering. The canvas before him was new. Wet paint bled into corners. From her distance, she could only make out movement. A sweep of color, the edge of a face, and something sharp lurking in the posture. He spoke to no one. Even when she came close enough to catch the smell of turpentine and smoke, he did not acknowledge her. A test, or perhaps a statement. So she lingered, a beat too long. He turned then, not with surprise, but with a kind of practiced slowness, as if greeting the inevitable. His expression wasn't smug, it wasn't pleased. It was quiet, as though the space between them had already said more than language ever could. There was no greeting, no clever nod, just a flicker of breath through his nose as he looked her over, from the buttons of her coat to the faint mark on her hand where the rifle strap had worn the skin raw. Then, without a word, he left her, not out of indifference and out of certainty, as if he'd written this moment hours ago in his head and didn't need to stay for the end. The invitation came 2 days later, slipped under her door, handwritten, sealed with wax, not printed, not encrypted, not even cautious. That was the game now, boldness pretending to be coincidence. Anya held the envelope in her hands without opening it. Santiago Velasquez had made his move. The predator hadn't bared teeth or sent threats. He'd drawn her in using only what he knew: mystery, restraint, and the promise of proximity. The gallery he'd invited her to was hidden behind a clothing boutique that sold nothing under €1,000. She passed through racks of fur and velvet, nodded at a clerk who smelled of opium and knew better than to ask questions. Through a side door, down a narrow hall, she emerged into a chamber of shadowed light. Here the walls were bare concrete, hung with oil paintings that looked scraped from the ruins of someone's mind. Flickering spotlights illuminated fragments: collarbone, wound, hunger, silence. A place where beauty rotted on purpose. He was waiting at the center, not beside a canvas, not behind a drink, just standing there in the eye of it all. Dressed in black, like a shadow, made flesh. She crossed the room without looking at anything, not because the art didn't interest her, but because he was watching, and she had no intention of giving him the satisfaction of distraction. She stopped 2 feet from him, close enough to feel the heat from his coat, the faintest exhale of whatever cigarettes he favored, the undercurrent of something more human: paper, oil, a trace of winter on wool. Still no words, just that same unbearable calm. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't with seduction or bravado or threat. It was curiosity. Not about who she was, but why she was still here. Why the girl who'd followed him for days had now stepped fully into the light and accepted his invitation. She gave him nothing in return. No answers. No name. Just a look. The kind that didn't blink. He stepped closer, not a threat, a dare, and it was the smallest shift. Just enough that she could smell the bitter edge of his skin, see the flicker of a vein at his throat, watch his lashes lower just slightly, as if the proximity were something to endure. She should have killed him then. No one was watching, no one would hear. 2 steps back, 1 twist, a knife beneath the ribs. He'd sink without a sound. She'd vanish. Instead, she stood still. They circled the gallery once, saying nothing. At the far corner, a painting caught her eye, not because of what it was, but because of what it wasn't. A blank canvas half covered in soot, smeared as if someone had tried to erase a face from it. The residue of something never meant to be seen. Santiago paused beside it. His voice, when it came, was low and distant, like a memory surfacing through water. He said the canvas had once held a woman's face. He said he'd painted her while she slept before she woke and saw herself in it. And then, because she did not like what she saw, she'd burned it. He looked at the ruined painting like it still held her ghost, or maybe his own. Anya didn't speak, but something in her shifted, not sympathy, not understanding, recognition. They stood there too long, close enough that even silence began to fray at the edges. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. What he said instead, soft, unforced, was that he hoped she'd come again. Not for him, for the gallery. Then he turned and left her in that room full of ruined things. She stayed for 20 minutes after, not watching the door and not planning the next move, and just breathing in the scent of paint and smoke, heart quiet, mind burning. When she left, the clerk didn't look up. The street outside had emptied, and her reflection in the boutique glass was almost unfamiliar. That night she unpacked the rifle again, not to use it, and to remind herself that it was still there, that she still could, if she chose. Chapter 4. Hunter's Hour. She found him again in the rain. No snow that evening, just a cold, wet mist that slicked the streets and made the light from the street lamps bleed into gold halos. The kind of weather that blurred outlines, made even killers feel like rumors. He was sitting on the low stone wall outside an abandoned opera house, coat collar turned up, cigarette trembling between two fingers. His other hand lay open in his lap, holding nothing. No book, no weapon, just silence. Anya watched from the mouth of the alley, invisible in the dark. She didn't move. Neither did he. Eventually, Santiago lifted his head. Not sharply, not startled. He didn't need to see her to know she was there. The cigarette flared once more before he dropped it, ground it into the wet stone with the heel of his boot, and rose. The movement was slow, unguarded. A man used to being alone. She followed at a distance far enough that her footfalls would vanish beneath the sound of the rain. He walked without purpose, past shuttered cafes and darkened apartment windows. He didn't check his reflection in shopfront glass, didn't glance over his shoulder, but his pace was deliberate, and when he turned into the narrow path that led toward the river, she knew. This was the moment he was giving her one. The ruined church waited at the edge of the water. The broken archway had collapsed further since she last saw it, and weeds clawed their way up the stone like old regrets. Inside, it was colder than outside. Air thick with damp and the memory of smoke. He stepped into the nave and stopped beneath the hollow window, where stained glass once hung. She followed, not cautiously, not quickly, but with the same inevitability that pulled the tide to shore. He didn't turn, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, gaze tilted upward toward a ceiling that no longer existed. When he finally moved, it was only to sit on the nearest stone bench, back straight, shoulders slightly hunched, like a penitent, or a patient waiting for news he already knew would kill him. She crossed the threshold without sound, stopped 2 paces behind him, and he didn't flinch. The silence stretched. She could hear her own breath, slow and measured. The rain on the stones outside, a car passing in the distance, too fast. Time moved differently here. Slower, thicker. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to her. Or maybe it was. His voice barely rose above the air, and his words bled into the stillness. He said some men were born into violence like it was a room with no door. Others walked in thinking they could leave when they wanted. And some, the worst kind, stayed because it was the only place they didn't feel alone. Anya didn't answer. Couldn't. He wasn't looking for answers. She watched his shoulders as he breathed. There was something wrong with the way they rose and fell. Too controlled. Like he was holding back a scream or a sob. But his face, when he turned, gave nothing away. He looked at her. Really looked. Not with suspicion or curiosity anymore, but with resignation. She sat beside him, not close, but close enough that the edge of her coat brushed his. He didn't move away. The rain outside thickened, wind rising against the crumbling walls. A shard of lightning lit the interior for half a breath. In that flash, she saw his hands again, pale, scabbed, ink-stained. The hands of a man who drew too hard and slept too little. And then she saw what he was holding. A page torn from a sketchbook, folded once. He passed it to her without looking. She opened it slowly. Another drawing, this one rougher than the others. Raw. Her. But not watching or standing or hidden. Sleeping. Hair tangled across her face, fingers curled near her lips. The drawing didn't flatter. It didn't soften. It exposed. And it was impossible, because she had never let herself sleep in the open. She turned the paper over, nothing on the back. When she looked at him again, he was already rising, leaving, no flourish, no final glance, just the soft echo of his footsteps receding into the nave. She stayed there long after he'd gone, and the page in her lap. The rain like static against the stone. She hadn't brought a weapon with her, not tonight, not because she'd forgotten, because some part of her already knew she wouldn't need it or wouldn't be able to use it, and not now. When she finally stood, the cold had sunk into her bones. She didn't shake it off and didn't want to. Back at the apartment, the rifle waited in its case. cleaned, oiled, expectant. She didn't open it. She sat at the table and unfolded the sketch again, spread it beside the dossier. The photo of Santiago, cold-eyed, stiff-jawed, suit-clad, looked like a ghost next to the version of him she'd just left. Two men, same face, different gravity. The silence in the apartment was thick but no longer empty. She poured herself a glass of water, drank half, then poured the rest down the sink. Sleep didn't come that night, and only the ache of restraint, the sensation of breath held too long, and the memory of two coats brushing in the dark. Chapter 5. Orders and Omens. The call came just before dawn. It wasn't loud or urgent, just a pulse. One vibration against the wood of the table, then silence. Anya didn't move. She'd been awake for hours, staring at the lines of Santiago's sketch folded on the table, the corners beginning to fray from her handling. The call came again. She didn't need to answer to know who it was. Still, she picked it up, pressed the phone to her ear, said nothing. Mikhail's voice slid through the line like oil through cold steel. No greetings, no concern, just pressure. He wanted a status update. He wanted a timeline. He wanted blood. Her silence stretched too long, he noticed. There was a pause on his end, brief but deliberate, before he asked if she was compromised. He didn't mean emotionally. He meant logistically, operationally. She said no, because that was the only word that would buy her time. He ended the call with a single word that wasn't Russian, not this time. He said, "Soon." And then he was gone. She placed the phone face down beside the glass of untouched water, stared at it until the light shifted behind the window. The city was waking. It would not wait for her. Later that morning, V appeared without warning. No knock, just the creak of the stairwell outside, then the soft rasp of nails tapping against the frame of Anya's door. When she opened it, V stepped inside like smoke, already stripping off her gloves. Platinum hair tucked under a beret, lips stained with the faintest trace of red wine from some train lounge or back alley bar. She didn't smile. She never did when she was working. The air between them was brittle, familiar, a tension that belonged to girls who'd learned too early how to hurt to be seen. V walked through the apartment without waiting to be invited. She glanced once at the rifle case, then again at the folded sketch beside the dossier. Her eyes lingered too long. She said nothing. Anya poured coffee. V didn't ask for any. She drank it anyway. After a long silence, V said Santiago's name. It was the first time it had been spoken aloud in the apartment. The syllables landed with the weight of a blade laid gently across a wrist. She asked if the job was delayed or abandoned. Anya didn't look at her, didn't answer. V leaned against the counter, watching. Her voice, when it came again, was quiet, measured. She didn't sound angry. She sounded disappointed. That was worse. She said the Bratva had ears here, eyes too. She warned that hesitation read as betrayal, that Mikhail didn't ask twice before sending a replacement. Then, after a pause, she asked the question that mattered. Was Anya planning to run? And it wasn't an accusation, it was a test. Anya turned away, washed the cup. Her hands moved with surgical precision, but her breath was no longer steady. Not completely. V stepped closer, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She reached for the sketch without asking. Anya moved first, snatched it away. For the first time, their eyes met, fully. No masks, no evasions, only the shared recognition of something broken, widening between them. V didn't press, and she left with a final glance, one that said she understood more than she let on. One that said she wouldn't protect her if it came to that. The door clicked shut behind her. Anya stood in the silence, fingers still curled around the page like it might burn through her skin if she let it go. That night, Santiago vanished. He didn't go to the gallery. Didn't walk his usual route. His window stayed dark. The doorman downstairs shrugged when Anya passed by, said nothing, but his eyes narrowed. She circled the city twice, checked the church, the wall outside the opera house, the gallery. even the bookstore with the spiral staircase and cracked front door. Nothing. It felt like absence and warning all at once. By midnight, she was back in the apartment. The rain had returned, heavier now, turning the windows into mirrors. Her phone remained silent, no messages, no calls, not from him, not from Mikhail. Still, the weight in her chest deepened. It wasn't worry, not exactly. It was unfinished instinct, the hunter without the hunted. She opened the rifle case and ran her fingers along the barrel. Clean. Ready. But something about it felt wrong now. Not useless, just misplaced. She slid it shut again and locked it. The next morning she waited. And the next. Still nothing. By the third day, the silence had changed shape. It was no longer empty, it was pointed. She couldn't tell if Santiago had disappeared or if he was finally waiting for her. The page with her portrait remained tucked into the edge of the mirror. She looked at it often, and not for answers, but for memory. A warning or an omen. She could no longer tell the difference. Chapter 6. The Quiet Kill. She picked the lock at midnight. The rain had stopped by then, leaving behind a sheen of wet stone and glass that reflected her figure in broken fragments as she crossed the street. Santiago's building loomed ahead, tall, quiet, unguarded. No sentry at the door, no eyes in the windows. She didn't expect him to be there, not really. She had told herself she was only checking, only verifying that he had not been lifted, not buried, not sent back in a crate to Mexico with a ribbon around his throat. But she'd brought the knife anyway, the small one hidden in the lining of her coat, honed to silence. The door clicked open with a soft sigh of hinges and darkness. No lights in the corridor. No sound beyond the hush of the elevator cables swaying slightly overhead. She bypassed them, took the stairs. Each one climbed in measured silence, feet landing without echo. His apartment door was unlocked. That detail caught her off guard. Not forced. Not damaged. Just ajar. She stepped through it like a ghost stepping back into her own grave. Inside, the air felt thick. The heat was off, the windows cracked. It smelled of iron and paint. Shadows moved along the walls like smoke from a fire long since smothered. She found him in the studio, not sitting, not standing. Just slumped beside the canvas as though he'd fallen asleep mid-confession. A ragged blanket hung around his shoulders. His left hand trembled on the floor, fingers smeared with red. Not blood, not all of it, but oil paint and something sharper. His knuckles were cracked. A bottle lay tipped on its side near the baseboard. The sketch pad had been torn in half. She didn't move at first, not because she was afraid, but because there was something sacred about the ruin of him. Not tragic, not theatrical, just human. The kind of human she'd been trained to ignore. A small noise broke the silence, his breath catching. Not quite a sob. Not a word. But a sound, scraped raw from something deeper than pain. He wasn't asleep. He was unraveling. She stepped forward, one hand on the knife out of habit, not intent. The closer she came, the more the scene revealed itself. His wrist was bandaged badly. A shallow cut. Intentional, but not lethal. Not meant to kill, only quiet the noise. His shirt was wrinkled, stained at the collar. His eyes flicked open when she reached him, but they didn't widen. He didn't startle. He saw her and something in him simply settled. No surprise, no alarm. Like he'd known she would come. She crouched beside him. Her fingers brushed the bottle aside, checked his pulse without ceremony. It beat fast but steady. His skin wasn't cold. The bleeding had stopped. Still, the canvas behind him unsettled her dot. Not because it was violent, but because it wasn't. It was a portrait of her. Not the sleeping sketch, not the blurred outlines he used as practice. This one was precise, honest. The tilt of her spine when she watched from across the street. The tension behind her eyes. Not a weapon, not a woman. Just her. He had painted her like she was the last true thing left in his world. She stood slowly, moved through the apartment to the kitchen. Found the first aid kit in a drawer with other untouched things. Tea bags, unopened mail. a child's drawing folded inside a recipe book. She returned, knelt, and unwrapped his wrist carefully. He didn't speak, but when her fingers brushed his skin, he closed his eyes, not from pain, but from relief. She dressed the wound cleanly. No tenderness, no cruelty, only efficiency. The silence between them was full now. Not empty, but filled with everything they could not afford to say. When she finished, she sat beside him against the wall, knees drawn up, coat still on. The night deepened around them, pressing against the glass. He didn't look at her, not directly. But he spoke then, for the first time. Voice, hoarse, from disuse. He said he used to believe there were people who could save you, until he realized some of them only came close enough to watch you drown. She didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, because she knew she might tell the truth. And the truth was, she had come tonight to kill him. Not out of duty, not even loyalty. She had come because it would have been easier than this, than whatever was forming now in the quiet space between a man who wanted to die and a woman who was built to deliver that death. But she hadn't done it, even here, even now. Instead, she stayed. He drifted into sleep beside her, breath steadying, fingers unclenched, and she remained by his side, eyes open, staring at the painting. It watched her as she watched him, a mirror without mercy. In the early hours before dawn, when the sky softened and the world turned silver, she finally closed her eyes. Not to rest, but to surrender just for a moment to stillness. The knife remained untouched in her coat. For the first time in her life, she hadn't chosen silence as a weapon. She had chosen it as a shelter. Chapter 7. Masks off. When she woke, the light had changed. Not bright, not warm. Just a dim, diffused silver that crept along the edges of the curtains and made the dust in the air feel like falling ash. Anya shifted slowly, head resting against the wall, neck stiff from sleeping upright. Her coat was still wrapped tight around her shoulders, but the cold had crept in anyway. Beside her, Santiago slept, his body curled slightly toward hers, not touching, but near enough that the rise and fall of his breath stirred the edge of her sleeve. His features were slack with exhaustion. The man who moved like a shadow through the city, who painted in chaos and walked through life as though haunted, now looked younger and strangely clean of artifice. Even in sleep, though, something in his expression resisted peace. The lines around his mouth pulled tight, his eyelids twitching once. She hadn't meant to sleep, not here, not next to him, not like this. It was careless, unprofessional, human. She stood without sound, spine aching from the hours pressed against stone, her knees stiff, breath shallow. The apartment was still. The door remained locked. The rain had started again outside, thin, tired. She moved through the space carefully, scanning it with renewed clarity. There were more canvases now than before, some stacked, some half-covered with tarps, others leaning against the walls like forgotten bodies. All of them unfinished, unlabeled, faces blurred, shapes distorted, but all of them bore the same signature: longing, unspoken, and unbearable. In the kitchen, the faucet sputtered once before giving in. The water was cold. She drank a handful and wiped her mouth on the sleeve of her coat. Her reflection in the microwave door looked wrong, not softened, just slightly unmoored, like a person paused between identities. Behind her, the sound of movement. She turned and Santiago was awake. He didn't speak, just leaned against the wall where she'd left him, hair disheveled, hands limp at his sides. The bandage on his wrist had loosened in the night. His eyes met hers, not sharp, not pleading, simply present. The silence between them stretched too long to be anything but intimate. She crossed the room slowly, and he watched her without flinching. He didn't ask why she had come, or why she had stayed. Perhaps he already knew. Perhaps he no longer cared about the reasons that had brought her into his orbit, only that she hadn't yet left it. When she reached him, he didn't move. He let her peel the old bandage from his skin, revealing the cut beneath, shallow, jagged, half-healed. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to interrupt. That was the difference. She cleaned the wound again silently, methodically, wrapping it with fresh gauze from the kit she'd left on the floor the night before. When she was done, she didn't step away. Neither did he. There was a pause, small and sharp, like the last second before the fall. And then he leaned forward, not like a question, like gravity. Their mouths met without urgency, without precision, just contact, skin to skin, breath to breath. A connection not born of want but of ache, of everything they hadn't said, couldn't ask, shouldn't feel. His hand stayed still, so did hers. It wasn't a kiss in the romantic sense. It was recognition, sealed between lips and silence. When they pulled apart, they didn't look away. The closeness didn't dissolve. If anything, it deepened, made heavier by the lack of words. No declarations, no apologies. Just breath shared in the shallow space between two people who had stopped pretending. She moved first, shedding her coat with a single gesture, boots kicked off in practiced silence. He stood, watching. Breath steady, but shallow. When he reached for her, it wasn't desperate, it was deliberate. Not to possess, but to prove something. To himself or to her, she didn't know. They didn't make love. That would have required something cleaner. What passed between them was not tenderness. It was surrender. Stripped of strategy, of posture, of mission. She didn't remember when they moved to the bed. Only the sensation of sheets cold against her back, his skin warm against hers, their hands moving with a kind of reverence that bordered on disbelief. No softness, no staged pleasure, just need and raw and reflexive, each movement punctuated by the silence they refused to fill with words. When it was over, they lay side by side, not touching, not speaking. The rain had stopped again, but the quiet in the room remained. Eventually, he reached for the edge of the blanket and pulled it over them both. Not an offering, just instinct. She closed her eyes, but only briefly. When she rose, it was slow, careful. He was already watching her, still silent, still unreadable. She reached for her coat, slid her arms into the sleeves. The weight of it felt heavier than before. As she bent to collect her boots, she felt it, the shift. Not in him, in herself. Something had fractured, or maybe something had surfaced. He sat up, bare chest lit by the dull gray light seeping through the window. His arms rested on his knees, one hand brushing absent-mindedly across the bandage on his wrist. Then, for the first time since she'd entered that apartment, he spoke in a way that cut clean through the room. He said he knew. Not everything, not the exact shape of her orders or the man who gave them. But enough. Enough to understand what she was. What she had been sent to do. Anya didn't answer. He didn't need her to. The confession wasn't meant to corner her. It wasn't even a confession. It was a permission slip. A way of saying, I see you. I've seen you for days and I stayed anyway. He looked at her then, not with accusation, but with a kind of quiet wonder, as if he were trying to memorize her one final time. He said if she was going to do it, it should be now. No pleading, no flinch, he just sat there waiting. Anya froze. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair, the leather of her gloves slick with sweat. He turned his head slightly, exposing his throat in that same deliberate way she'd once seen soldiers do in old executions. The final gesture of acceptance. But this wasn't theater. This was trust. Or something more dangerous than trust. She stepped forward. Not to kill. To leave. She crossed the room in silence, her fingers brushing the doorframe as she passed. And then she was gone. Not fast, not fleeing, just gone. Back on the street, the rain had begun again, fine and invisible, soaking her collar and making her hair stick to her cheekbones. She didn't notice. The night stretched before her like a long, narrow corridor, every light along it dimmed by the weight of what she hadn't done. She didn't go back to the safe house, didn't report in, didn't check her messages. Instead, she walked. Past the church. Past the gallery. Past the ruins of her mission. still smoldering behind her ribs. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Vilnius, she didn't feel like a weapon. She felt like something else, something unfinished, something dangerous. Chapter 8. Blood Price. By the time she returned to the apartment, the city had begun to shift. Not in ways most would notice, no sudden gunfire in the streets, no overt threat, no message carved into glass. But the rhythm had changed. The man who sold cigarettes on the corner watched her too closely. A parked car sat longer than it should have, engine still warm, though no one had exited. Shadows moved differently, more eyes, fewer mistakes. The Bratva had seen the silence, and it had begun to respond. Anya closed the door behind her, then bolted it, not out of fear, but because instinct now moved faster than thought. The space was unchanged, the same peeling wallpaper, the scent of cold metal and gun oil lingering faintly in the corners. But something in her felt altered. The air inside no longer felt safe. Not because someone had been there, because someone would. She didn't remove her coat, just moved straight to the table, slid the dossier from the drawer, and spread it open one last time. Santiago's photograph stared back. That carefully sculpted image of a man meant to be feared, a mask, a lie. The photo was so clean, so official, so divorced from the weight she had felt in his arms and the hoarseness in his voice as he dared her to kill him. Paper could not hold what lived in him now. She closed the file without looking at the rest. It didn't matter anymore. She had chosen. It wouldn't be enough to save him, but it would be enough to damn her. A sound from the hall. A soft scrape, then the echo of footsteps moving with too much purpose to be a stranger. She reached for the knife beneath the floorboard just as the knock came. Quiet. Familiar. She opened the door without speaking. V stood there. Rain glistening in her platinum hair, a cigarette tucked behind her ear like she'd been too distracted to smoke it. No smile, no casual remark. Just her eyes, sharp and assessing. Without waiting, she stepped inside. Her gloves were off. She didn't take her coat off either. They stood there silent in the dim light of the hallway. Anya didn't move. V didn't speak. But the weight between them pressed in like fog. When V finally spoke, her voice was low even. She asked when Anya had stopped being herself. She didn't mean it as cruelty. There was no mockery in her tone, just a quiet hurt, buried too deep to bleed. Anya didn't answer. V stepped further in, glancing once at the sealed rifle case, once at the untouched dossier. Then her gaze returned to Anya, and for the first time since they were teenagers sharing missions and bruises, there was something like fear behind her expression. She said the order had been rerouted. She said someone else had been sent, someone who didn't care about subtlety, someone who would not hesitate. A name Anya didn't recognize but didn't need to. It was the kind of name that followed bodies into closed rooms and left behind blood and silence. Then, more softly, V told her she shouldn't return to the apartment again, that there were eyes on the building, on her, that the last thread of trust Mikhail had in her was fraying, and when it snapped, she would go down with it. Still, Anya said nothing. She was past the point of arguments, past justifications. What was left was only motion, decisions already made, even if the cost had not yet been paid. V stepped close, too close. She reached into her coat and produced a folded slip of paper, holding it out without explanation. An address, an old name scribbled in one corner. A place where Santiago would be, she said. Tonight, a meeting he couldn't refuse, a trap he didn't know to fear. Anya took the paper and stared at it, her fingers slow to fold it back. And then V asked the question she'd been holding since she arrived. Not, why didn't you kill him? Not, what did he do to you? Just, what did you see in him that you never saw in me? The air cracked around it, not loud, not dramatic, but final. Anya blinked once. A muscle in her jaw tightened. She didn't answer, because the truth, whatever it was, had no place in that moment. They stood in silence a while longer, long enough for the rain outside to shift to sleet. long enough for V's breath to mist slightly in the cold air of the stairwell. Then she turned and left. No goodbye, no threat, only the soft echo of boots on concrete. Anya remained by the door, fingers still clenched around the paper. It hadn't surprised her. The order being rerouted, it hadn't shocked her, hearing that someone else had been sent. What struck her most was that V had come to warn her, and that she had asked that question. Not like a woman losing a mission, not like a woman losing someone. By nightfall, the air had thickened. Wind swept low across the buildings and the streetlights flickered in odd patterns, as though something in the grid sensed what was coming. Anya moved like smoke through the city. No hesitation, no disguise, the kind of movement that came from muscle memory, not thought. Her destination was clear. The address V had given led to a building on the edge of the river. Not a warehouse, not a gallery, but an old bathhouse long since gutted and repurposed. The exterior was unmarked. No guards, no obvious signs of surveillance, and too perfect. She entered through the rear. The door wasn't locked. Inside it was warm, damp. The sound of dripping water echoed in the tiled hallways. Somewhere, something hummed. Machinery, or breath. The windows were bricked up. The light was all artificial, humming low and jaundiced. She moved without sound. No footsteps and no draw of breath, and only the weight of time collapsing around her. She found him on the second floor. Santiago sat alone on a bench near the far wall, back turned, hands folded in his lap. He didn't move when she entered. Didn't look up. But he knew. He had known before she arrived that it wasn't an ambush, it was bait. Not for him, for her. And she had come, of course she had. He turned slowly and met her gaze. No smile, no accusation. Only that same unbearable clarity. Anya didn't speak. She walked to him, boots echoing faintly now, no longer bothering with stealth. He rose, and no fear in his stance, no defense. He simply stood there, watching her. And somewhere in the corner of the room, behind the rusted metal pipes and thick curtain of steam, she sensed another presence. Watching, waiting. The moment stretched, then snapped, and she took his hand, and he didn't pull away. They ran, not from each other, but from the price that had finally come due. Chapter 9. Collapse. The streets blurred past them like a dream, too fast to hold. They moved through the city without words, not out of fear, but necessity. The bathhouse door had barely closed behind them before the trap had begun to spring. Faint shifts in the air, the sound of boots behind walls, the electric snap of radios being raised to mouths. Anya knew that shape. It wasn't panic, it was control. Their control, not hers. Santiago ran with surprising fluidity. Not the mindless sprint of someone untrained, but a steady, efficient pace, like he had rehearsed this moment alone in the dark. He didn't ask questions, didn't look back. He trusted her now, or he had finally accepted that no one else was coming. They cut through alleys and down narrow stairwells, moving deeper into the old city where the streets lost their names and the maps grew unreliable. The fog was thicker here, rolling low across the stones like smoke rising from the underground. Somewhere behind them, a car engine turned over. Somewhere closer, footsteps paused. But no bullets came. Not yet. Anya led them into the mouth of an abandoned transit tunnel, sealed on one end and forgotten on the other. She had found it weeks ago, marking it as an emergency fallback. Now it served as sanctuary, the kind made of rust and rot and silence. Inside, the air was metallic and cold. They stopped beneath a collapsed section of wall where broken tile and steel rebar created a natural barrier. Santiago leaned against it, breath shallow but measured, his skin damp with sweat. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She listened. Above them, nothing moved. No voices, no pursuit, and for now. Anya crouched beside the entrance, eyes trained on the narrow sliver of light bleeding through the cracks in the door. Her mind ran calculations out of habit. How long until the signal reaches Mikhail? How long until V chooses a side? How long before the men behind the wall stop circling and start hunting? Then Santiago spoke, his voice low and frayed, as if the words were dragged out of him. He asked her how long they had. She didn't answer. There was no number that mattered now, only choices, only cost. He didn't push, just let the silence fill the space again. After a while, he sat, back against the wall, his fingers tracing the edge of a crack in the tile like he was sketching again. Not a picture this time, but a memory. She wondered what image lived behind his eyes now. Not her face, surely. Not anymore. He said nothing when she pulled the small pistol from inside her coat and set it beside her. It wasn't a gesture of trust. It was just truth. The only language either of them understood anymore. Outside, footsteps returned, faint, muffled by stone and distance, but deliberate. She shifted slightly, hand resting on her thigh, eyes narrowed. Still not shooting, still circling. They weren't here for a kill, and not yet. They were waiting for her to bring him out, and it was never about Santiago, and it was always about her. Her delay, her betrayal, her choice. The quiet between them thickened. Santiago tilted his head back against the wall, eyes closing briefly. Then he asked what she would do if they caught them. If the choice came down to one bullet, one name. She didn't flinch, and she just said, "I won't let them take you." He looked at her then, slowly, fully, as if measuring her sincerity not by her words but by the silence they left behind. Then he nodded just once, not agreement, just understanding. She moved to the far side of the tunnel and lifted the metal grate that concealed the narrow crawl space leading into the drainage system. Cramped, filthy, perfect. She motioned for him to go first. He hesitated, not out of mistrust but reluctance. Like he knew the moment he crawled into that hole, everything would change. And he was right. They slid through the tunnel in silence, their shoulders scraping against damp stone, the stench of rust and rot closing in around them. The only sound was breath. The only light was the occasional glint of metal from her pistol. They emerged 2 blocks south behind an abandoned hotel that had once been glamorous, now crumbled and moss-streaked. The facade sagged under the weight of years and secrets. They slipped inside. She took them to the 3rd floor to a room she'd marked months earlier as vacant and unregistered, a place the Bratva had once used for temporary storage before shifting operations elsewhere. It still smelled of dust and mildew, but the door locked from the inside. That was enough. Once inside, Santiago sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees. He didn't ask what came next. She stood near the window, watching the street below, one hand braced against the peeling frame. The silence stretched again. But this time it wasn't protective, it was fraying. He said her name once, not as a question, not as a plea, just to see if it still meant anything. She didn't turn, didn't move. But her fingers curled slightly against the windowsill. He stood slowly, walked to her, stopping just behind. Close, but not touching. The air between them was warm now, not from comfort, but from tension. He asked if it was worth it, all of it. The time she spent watching. The silence she broke. The line she crossed. She didn't answer, but her body shifted, just slightly, toward him. And that was enough, and he stepped back and let her breathe. Let her think. She turned only after he sat again, his posture heavier now, the lines on his face carved deeper by exhaustion. Then came the sound she hadn't wanted, not from the street, from the door. Not a knock, a single deliberate click, the latch sliding open. She moved before she thought, pistol raised, breath gone. But it wasn't Bratva, not yet, it was V, alone, unarmed. Her eyes locked on Anya immediately, then on Santiago. Then back. No words, no smile. Just disappointment sharpened into something colder. She stepped in, shut the door behind her, walked to the center of the room and stopped, her boots leaving damp imprints on the rotting floorboards. She looked like someone who had already buried a future. Anya didn't lower the weapon. V didn't reach for hers. Then V spoke. She said they had less than an hour, that Mikhail had ordered the kill cleared and the team was on its way. She hadn't come to stop them. She had come to give her a chance at the last one. Then she looked at Anya and said something quieter. Not an order, not even a warning, just a sentence. You don't get to be both. And she turned and left. The door closed behind her. This time there was no click and only the silence of what remained. Chapter 10. Velvet Trigger. The city felt slower that morning, like something had been removed from it in the night. The fog hung low across the rooftops, not moving, as if it too were waiting. Inside the crumbling hotel room, time had stopped. Anya sat on the edge of the mattress, back straight, fingers wrapped around the grip of her pistol. She hadn't moved in nearly an hour. Santiago stood near the window, half lit by the weak morning light, the frame casting soft bars of shadow across his chest. His shirt was rumpled, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a streak of dried blood faint on the collar from the scrape he'd taken crawling through the tunnel. Neither of them had spoken since V left. There was nothing left to say. The quiet wasn't tender. It was the kind of silence that followed an ending already written, only waiting now for the last breath to be drawn, the final shape to settle. Anya's thoughts moved with precision, but her body felt remote. She had done this a dozen times in a dozen places. The end always arrived like this, sudden but expected, close but untouchable. And yet this time the final step refused to come. Not because of hesitation or weakness or even love. She had never let herself believe that word belonged to them, but because she understood now that this wasn't about pulling a trigger. It was about choosing what came after. The Bratva wouldn't wait. Mikhail had made that clear. The team was already in place, likely surrounding the block. If she left alone, she might survive. If she stayed, they would kill her too. There was no version where this ended quietly. The only variable left was Santiago, and what she was willing to do for him. He turned from the window at last, his gaze calm, as though he had already accepted whatever came next. Not brave, not detached, just resolved. She had seen that expression before, not on him, but on the ones who knew they wouldn't be walking out of a room again. The ones who'd stopped begging for mercy or hoping for luck. It wasn't surrender. It was peace earned at the edge of violence. He looked at the pistol in her hand, then at her, but he didn't speak. He didn't ask. She rose slowly, legs stiff, the room around her tilting slightly as the weight of the night settled into her spine. She crossed to him with measured steps. No rush, no fear, only purpose. Their eyes locked. The distance between them evaporated. She raised the pistol and pressed it to his chest just above his heart. His breath didn't catch and he only closed his eyes. For a moment she saw the boy he might have been. The one who had drawn buildings and shadows in notebooks, who had stood in cathedrals to feel small, who had spoken Neruda aloud to the emptiness and waited for someone, anyone, to hear. She saw him clearly, and that was the moment she pulled the trigger. The sound was muffled, the impact immediate, but Santiago didn't fall. He staggered back, confusion flashing across his face before he saw it. The hole in the plaster behind him. The thin trail of smoke curling from the window frame. The hiss of air rushing through broken glass. She hadn't shot him. She had shot through the wall, and now they knew. The Bratva, wherever they were stationed, wherever they were watching, now had their answer. She had taken her shot, reportedly, visibly, and missed deliberately. She stepped toward him and grabbed his hand before he could speak, before the question formed in his mouth, before gratitude or anger or shock could reach the surface. She pulled him toward the door. No time for explanation. They ran down the stairs, through the hollow lobby into the morning haze. The street was empty, too empty. No cars, no footsteps, just that unbearable quiet. A breath held by the city. They moved fast, darting between buildings, cutting south toward the station. She had arranged a route months ago, a fail-safe exit through an abandoned checkpoint tied to a forgotten Bratva smuggling lane, but she didn't know if it was still viable. If they had already sealed it. If she had already waited too long. They turned a corner and the trap closed at two men. Both armed, not cartel, not local police, not Bratva. She slowed. raised her hands. Santiago froze behind her. The men didn't shout, didn't posture. They didn't have to. The taller one, younger, stepped forward, raised his weapon, his finger on the trigger, calm as water. He addressed her by name, not the alias, the real one. No emotion in his tone, only the question behind the gun. Anya looked at him, then at the other. She recognized neither, but they knew her. That was enough. She reached slowly for the pistol at her belt, held it out in both hands, grip first, and placed it on the ground. The taller one tilted his head. He didn't lower the gun. She straightened. Spoke her first word since the morning began. "Tell Mikhail it's done." The lie landed cleanly, and then she nodded at Santiago. Said nothing. The man looked past her, studying the target. No blood, no wound, no confirmation. The silence stretched. And then, for a reason Anya would never understand, whether it was the smoke from the wall, or the calm in her eyes, or simply a decision made above their heads, the younger one lowered the weapon. He gestured with a tilt of his chin. "Go." She didn't wait. She turned, took Santiago's hand, and this time they didn't run. They walked. Slow, deliberate, away from the men, away from the building, away from everything. No one followed. Not yet. They didn't speak until they reached the alley 2 blocks down, hearts pounding, lungs burning. Santiago turned to her, his mouth already open with the question she'd been avoiding for days. But she didn't let him speak. She just said one word. "Go." He hesitated, and this time she looked at him fully. Not as a mission, not as a mistake, but as the one thing she had never been trained for. Then she turned and walked the other way, back toward the edge of the city. Toward the one who had made her, toward the price, because there was always a price, and in the end, even weapons choose where they aim.